All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly pivotal conflict that took America from a scrappy republic and transformed it into a massive continental superpower, literally stretching from sea to shining sea. But as we're going to see, that expansion came with a really heavy cost, because unknowingly, this very war served as the bloody, brutal training ground for the American Civil War. You know, there is this deep, dramatic irony hanging over this entire conflict. Think about the most legendary opposing generals of the American Civil War. Guys like Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Well, they didn't start out as enemies. No way. They actually learned their deadly trade fighting side by side, bleeding together down in Mexico. I really want you to keep these names in mind, because their shared experiences here totally set the stage for everything that follows in American history. So to really understand how we got there, we have to look at how incredibly fast things escalated in Texas, because Texas wasn't always American. Going all the way back to 1519, it was part of the vast Spanish Empire. Then, in 1821, Mexico wins its independence, and Texas becomes Mexican territory. Now, Mexico actually invited American settlers in, but, well, they soon realized that might have been a mistake when the settlers refused to assimilate, or, crucially, drop the practice of slavery. This caused some fierce friction, leading directly to Texan independence in 1836. And finally, in 1845, President James K. Polk, a guy who was on an absolute mission to expand America to the Pacific, officially annexed Texas. But there was a massive catch here, and it totally lit the fuse. The border was heavily disputed. Texas claimed the border was all the way down at the Rio Grande. Mexico, on the other hand, claimed it was the Nuez River, which is about 150 miles further north. Now, President Polk, who had already tried and failed to just buy the Western Territories for $25 million, intentionally ordered General Zachary Taylor's army right into the middle of this 150-mile disputed zone. It was basically the 1846 equivalent of parking your truck on your neighbor's lawn just to provoke a fight. And a fight is exactly what he got. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry ambushed a small American patrol on the north bank of the Rio Grande. 11 Americans were killed in what we now call the Thornton Affair. And honestly, this was exactly what Polk needed. He went straight to Congress and boldly declared that Mexican forces had shed American blood upon American soil. Now, a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln actually objected, astutely pointing out that the soil was, highly disputed. But despite that, Congress went ahead and officially declared war. Right out of the gate, General Zachary Taylor finds himself severely outnumbered. We're talking just 2,300 of his men, staring down a Mexican army of 3,700. So, what does Taylor do? He whips out this devastating new American military innovation called flying artillery. These were light, highly mobile cannons mounted on really fast carriages. They could gallop all the way across a battlefield, blast enemy formations to pieces, and then just vanish before the enemy could even react. This high-speed tactic absolutely shredded the Mexican cavalry and got Taylor some decisive early victories within just the first 11 days. Now, let's look at the big picture, because Polk wasn't just fighting a little border skirmish here. He orchestrated this massive four-pronged master plan to totally overwhelm Mexico. First prong, Taylor pushes south from Texas. Second prong, Colonel Stephen Kearny marches his troops across a brutal desert to grab New Mexico and California. Third, the U.S. Navy swoops in to seize California's vital ports. And fourth, this is the ultimate hammer blow, General Winfield Scott is set to launch a staggering invasion straight into the heart of Mexico. We are talking about an unprecedented scale of simultaneous attacks designed to just crush Mexico on all fronts. But as you can guess, this grand strategy quickly ran into a major obstacle, specifically at the fortress city of Monterrey. This place was defended by 7,000 Mexican troops, thick stone walls, and snipers on the rooftops. Marching an army down those narrow streets? Absolute death trap. So the Texas Rangers stepped in and taught the army this brutal, totally visceral tactic called mouse hauling. Instead of running down those deadly streets, American soldiers used pickaxes and explosives to literally blast holes through the interior walls of the houses. They fought room to room, building to building. It is a grueling, terrifying way to fight, but it worked, and it forced the city's surrender after 3 incredibly bloody days. So you think the president would be thrilled, right? Well, despite Taylor's success at Monterrey, Polk was actually furious that Taylor let the Mexican army walk away with an armistice. Plus, Polk was getting deeply paranoid about Taylor's growing political popularity back home. So Polk spitefully strips Taylor of most of his troops. The infamous Mexican leader Santa Anna sees this sudden weakness, marches 15,000 men through the desert, and demands that Taylor surrender immediately. Taylor's response? Legendary. He simply said, "Tell him to go to hell." And with just 4,600 untested volunteers and some brilliant artillery work, Taylor miraculously holds his ground and survives the onslaught. With Santa Anna forced to retreat south, Mexico now had to face the fourth and final prong of Polk's invasion plan. Enter General Winfield Scott. This guy was a towering, pompous perfectionist. He stood 6'5" and weighed nearly 300 pounds, but what he executed was just breathtaking. Scott personally orchestrated the largest amphibious landing in American history up to that point. In a single afternoon, he puts 12,000 troops ashore just south of Veracruz, completely encircles the city, and forces its surrender. And he did all of that without losing a single man in the landing. Unbelievable. But securing the coast is one thing. Marching 200 miles inland through brutal terrain to a heavily fortified capital, that is an entirely another. Even the Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon, looked at this wildly risky inland strategy and flat out declared, "Scott is lost." At a place called Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna thought his flank was perfectly protected by impassable mountains. But Scott sent a young scout named Robert E. Lee. Lee crept so close to the enemy lines, he actually had to hide under a log for hours while Mexican scouts walked right past him. Lee finds a hidden mountain path. Scott perfectly flanks Santa Anna, and the Mexican army collapses so fast that Santa Anna literally left his wooden leg behind in the mud. As Scott's forces pushed to the very outskirts of Mexico City, the war took a deeply personal turn. At the Battle of Churubusco, American forces ran into a unit they had been hunting for over a year, Los San Patricios. These were mostly Irish Catholic immigrants who had faced some severe prejudice in the U.S. Army and actually defected to Mexico. Flying a bright green flag with a golden harp, they manned the cannons at a convent and fought with total desperation. They were physically tearing down the white flags of surrender raised by their Mexican commanders because they knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured. Eventually, the convent was overrun in some truly vicious hand-to-hand combat. And the fate of those captured San Patricios? Incredibly grim. Their leader, an Irishman named John Riley, was actually spared the hangman's noose on a pure technicality. He happened to desert just before the formal declaration of war. Instead, General Scott ordered a gruesome punishment. Riley was whipped 50 times, and then they heated up an iron to brand a D for deserter deeply into his cheek. The executioner accidentally burned it upside down, so they just pinned him back down and branded his other cheek too. Now only one obstacle stood between Scott and Mexico City: Chapultepec Castle. It was a formidable fortress that housed Mexico's military academy, defended mostly by raw guardsmen and teenage cadets. The assault was a brutal sequence. First, a grueling 14-hour artillery bombardment shattered the defenses. Then, 7,000 American soldiers charged up the incredibly steep slope under heavy fire. They hit the walls and just stalled out. There was this agonizing wait because the scaling ladders hadn't arrived yet. Men like Lee, Grant, and Pickett were all pinned on that slope, just waiting to die until the ladders finally arrived and they violently breached the walls. But right as that final victory was secured, a deeply chilling scene unfolded just a mile away. The American colonel in charge of the remaining 50 condemned San Patricios had 30 of them staged on a wooden platform with nooses around their necks. He forced them to watch the Mexican flag come down in the distance, and then ordered the platforms dropped to hang them at the exact, precise second the American flag crested Chapultepec Castle. It was a very dark, vindictive piece of military theater. The very next morning, the city officially surrendered, resulting in a completely surreal scene. General Winfield Scott, wearing this immaculate dress uniform, rides triumphantly into the heart of Mexico City to the tune of Yankee Doodle. He calmly dismounts, walks right into the great National Palace, and becomes the only American to ever rule Mexico from its own seat of government. And if you ever heard the famous Marine hymn lyric, "From the Halls of Montezuma," well, this unbelievable moment is exactly where that comes from. So, with the capital occupied, President Polk's ambition hits its peak. He decides he wants to annex the entire country of Mexico. He sends a diplomat, Nicholas Trist, down to negotiate it. But Trist gets there and sees that the Mexicans and Americans are actually getting along pretty well in the occupied city. Refusing to completely destroy a sovereign nation, Trist flat out defies Polk's greedy orders. Even when Polk tried to officially fire him, Trist just refused to leave. Instead, he stubbornly hammers out the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which secured the Rio Grande border and the entirety of the American Southwest, all for a payment of $15 million. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of what Tristan negotiated here, picture this: 525,000 square miles of land transferred to the United States. That is more than half of Mexico's original territory. It is an absolutely staggering land grab that fundamentally reshaped the map of North America. And for his insubordination? For literally securing the American West, Trist was fired the very second he got home, denied all his back pay, and lived in poverty for 20 years. I guess you simply couldn't defy the president and get away with it. And hey, if you want a moment of sheer historical absurdity, listen to this. Just 9 days after Mexico signed away this massive chunk of territory, a carpenter out in California reaches into a cold stream and pulls up gold. Within a single year, 300,000 Americans poured into California. The territory Mexico had literally just surrendered would immediately trigger a massive gold rush, soon becoming the richest state in the richest nation on Earth. The timing of it all is just mind-boggling. But before we marvel too much at the map and all the riches, we absolutely have to look at the grim human cost. Of the 13,000 American soldiers who died in this war, only about 1,700 were actually killed in combat. Think about that. The vast, overwhelming majority died from disease, dysentery, and harsh elements far from home. This sprawling new empire was bought with an immense amount of quiet suffering in forgotten camps and makeshift hospitals. Which brings us right back to our opening thought, because this war left ghosts, and it left a terrifying legacy of seasoned, battle-hardened officers. Lee, Grant, Jackson, Longstreet, Davis, Sherman. They all learned how to fight here, mastering brutal tactics like flying artillery and mouse hauling. They bled together in Mexico to build a continental empire. So what I want you to take away from this explainer is this really provocative question. How did these exact same men, these young brothers-in-arms of 1848, turn those deadly tactics against each other